Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. Starting with round number 6 of the Amsterdam 1889 tournament, we will be taking our look at Lasker's gauntlet, as he must face in succession the 3 internationally established masters competing in this tournament, Mason, Byrne, and Gunsberg, without any weaker opposition in between. It's going to be quite the experience. Starting off this gauntlet is the man who will next challenge for the World Chess Championship in the following year, Isidor Gunsberg. Now, Gunsberg got his start in chess by playing behind the automaton Mephisto, something like a chess-playing robot that Gunsberg was able to control using electromagnetism, allowing him to play in secret, let's say. Now, Mephisto, and by extension Gunsberg, holds the record for being the first, in a sense, non-human to win a chess tournament, which was done back in 1878. This format may look a little bit weird. It was a 16-player knockout event, so 4 rounds, Mephisto won every round, he won the tournament. Under his own name, it wouldn't be until 1885 that Gunsberg would begin winning his own tournaments, and there's quite a few, so let's get into it. At the first British Chess Association Championship held in 1885, Gunsberg would take clear first, therefore becoming something like the British champion. He would follow this up by winning the German Chess Federation Congress later that year, giving him 2 titles to his name in only 1 year. Very impressive. When tasked with defending his BCA championship in 1886, he unfortunately fell half a point shy of his rivals Byrne and Joseph Blackburn, but there's only so much you can do. He would rectify this in the following year by tying with Byrne for first place, and therefore, in a sense, winning back his title. His attempt to defend his German Chess Federation title was much less successful, on the other hand, as 8.5 out of 20 was just enough to be somewhere in the middle of the pack. A bad result happens to all of us now and then. Finally, in 1888, he would, for the first time, successfully defend his BCA title, winning the tournament by 1.5 points over the rest of the field. Very impressive stuff. Now this brings us to the year we are currently looking at, 1889, where Gunsberg had quite possibly the most important result of his career, which was a 3rd place finish at the 6th American Chess Congress held in New York. This tournament was special in that it acted as something like a proto-candidates tournament, in that the winner received the right to challenge the current world champion, Wilhelm Steinitz, to a match for the title. Now, the thing here is that Mikhail Chigorin had recently played a World Chess Championship match, and therefore he declined this offer. As well, the person who tied with him, Max Weiss, also declined. So Gunsberg was in a pretty favorable position, all things considered. Now, the rules of the tournament did not explicitly allow him to challenge for the title directly, but it did give him quite a bit of evidence that he is a decent challenger, and so he wanted to play a little bit more chess to really assert himself as the next challenger, and so he did. He competed at the 1889 Breslau Congress, which we recently covered. He came in shared 4th, the same as Johann Bauer. We are currently going over him playing in this tournament, and if you'll allow me to look into the future ever so slightly, he would again defend his BCA title later in 1889, sort of. He tied with Henry Bird, as you can see, but at this point they were using a tiebreak system, the Sonneborn-Burger system, I believe, and Bird did technically win on tiebreaks, so it's close, but Gunsberg is clearly still performing at a very high level. I think I've talked more than enough about this guy for the time being. We will see him later in the saga, so I'll update you on his endeavors to fight for the World Championship and all the drama that happened in between there. But for now, I think it's about time we see how this World Chess Championship challenger plays the game of chess. Isidor Gunsberg, sitting behind the white pieces, opens this game with e4. Lasker, in his 4th black game in a row, don't know who's in charge of the schedule for this, responds again with e5. Knight to f3, knight f6, knight c6, bishop to b5, now knight to f6, so we got a nice little Berlin defense here. And Gunsberg decides to play the 3rd most popular move in this position after castles and your anti-Berlins with d3 by playing the move queen to e2. Now, Gunsberg himself sort of recently faced this. He had to defend against this move twice in an 1887 match against one of his main British rivals, Joseph Blackburn. In their first encounter, Gunsberg started with a6, and this is a very short game, so I'll just go over it really quickly. Bishop to a4, bishop to c5, c3, b5, bishop to c2, all fairly normal. And now Gunsberg decided to play the move d5, which looks promising if it works, but it turns out to be a mistake, as after e captures d5 and queen captures on d5, white is more than happy to blow up the center with d4. The queen being on e2 ensures that all of the tactics work in white's favor. The game continued bishop to d6, and after bishop to b3, queen to e4 was played, and Blackburn simply took here on e4. And Gunsberg just resigned here on move 11, as of course knight captures on e4 runs into bishop to d5, winning a piece and the game. In the second encounter, Gunsberg went for bishop to e7, which is Lasker's choice as well. c3 here, and now d6. d3, and in this position, Lasker goes for the move bishop to d7. Against Blackburn, Gunsberg played the also natural castles, following the moves knight b to d2 and knight back to e8, knight to f1, and now the very aggressive f5. Blackburn played bishop to c4 with check, the king moved to h8, e captures f5, bishop captures on f5, this knight brought itself to e3, and only now did Gunsberg put his bishop on d7, and Gunsberg would actually go on to win this game as black. But okay, with bishop to d7, the players are now in their own territory. Gunsberg retreats his bishop here to a4, and now we're in a position where there are very few games, which is somewhat surprising for the Ruy Lopez, but here we are. The only other move played in this position is, again, the very natural move castles, where after bishop to b3, h6, knight b to d2, this knight also moved not to e8, but to h7, where after knight to f1, we didn't see the aggressive f5, but rather black went for the move knight to g5. This was played between the two Russian players Vitaly Sheshkovsky, sorry for that, and Anatol Lakasto in 1991, with white ultimately winning this game. Lasker instead decided to play the move queen to c8. This move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 7 that the players are playing a unique game. Now this move might look strange, but Lasker demonstrates why he's playing it very quickly. After again knight b to d2, he retreats his knight back to d8, offering the trade of light squared bishops, which Gunsberg declines with bishop to b3. And now bishop to e6, offering it again. Now we can see that because he's placed his pieces here, he can defend the bishop and accept the bishop trade without damaging his pawn structure with f captures on e6. Gunsberg plays knight to f1. He's fine with allowing the bishop exchange, but on his terms, he wouldn't mind opening up the a file over here. Lasker keeps things flexible with c6. We have knight to g3, queen to c7, and both players castle. So now that both players have castled on the king side, Gunsberg doesn't necessarily benefit as much from the a file opening up, as of course all the action is going to be happening on the other side of the board. So bishop to c2. Okay. Lasker continues developing with rook to e8, and now Gunsberg decides to really start the activities with d4. Okay. If you take here as black, e captures on d4, runs into knight captures on d4. This hits the bishop, and if you want to keep your bishop pair, which you probably do in such an open position, you retreat it back to, let's say, d7, and now simply bishop to d2. Rook a to e1 is coming soon, followed closely by f4, where white is very happy with the extra space and the very active pieces. I don't think they would have anything to complain about here. So Lasker doesn't have to allow that, and he instead plays another one of his very weird retreating moves, bishop back to f8. We'll see this move come up in a second, especially after Gunsberg decides to start going on his own offensive with knight to h4. No doubt trying to get something here on f5, which Lasker prevents as planned with g6. The bishop is coming to g7 right away. Now this is a very complex position, as positions tend to be when there have been zero exchanges. Gunsberg decides to play a very natural looking move, bishop to g5. Why not? You develop the bishop very nicely, attack this undefended knight. Another move that I think is actually quite strong is f4. You're really trying to play against this g6 move. Black doesn't have to take this pawn, but if you get f5 in here as white, then suddenly the black king side starts to look a little bit shaky. And after e captures on f4, rook captures on f4. This hits the knight, bishop to g7 is planned, and again, white simply plays bishop to d2. The other rook's going to come to the f-file, and like before, white is going to enjoy plenty of space, very active pieces, and again, I can't see them complaining about anything. They simply look pleasantly better here. Now, bishop to g5 is not a bad move in any sense of the word. It's just slightly less direct. Here, Lasker gets to play the move bishop to g7, and now we have a position where, once again, Gunsberg does have a move to give him a very comfortable advantage, though the reasoning behind it is perhaps a little bit more nebulous than before. So what I would like you to do, pause the video, see if you can find the move that Gunsberg has at his disposal here in order to really get the game going in his favor. All right, 3, 2, 1. Now I should clarify by saying that there are quite a few moves that are good here. f4, again, still works perfectly fine. Trading here is a good start, but the move that I really want to focus on here as white is the sacrifice knight h to f5. Now, here, if you try to trade with bishop captures on f5, e captures on f5 comes, and now black does have access to this very clever move e captures on d4, opening up the rook, but now the queen will come to f3, and now white threatens to take on g6, and this pressure here on the f6 knight is just unbearable. White's going to win something in this position. So you more or less have to accept the sacrifice here as black, and after g captures on f5, e captures on f5, the best I think black has is to develop this bishop as actively as possible with bishop to d5. Now white has yet another very clever move here, either rook a, or I have here in my notes rook f to e1. The point being that now e captures on d4 does absolutely nothing. White doesn't mind this attack at all because they're allowed to trade here on e8, queen e8, knight e8, rook e8, and after the bishop goes to f8, white plays bishop to h6 and wins. Very straightforward. So let's say black plays a neutral move, tries to get the king to safety, let's say. Now white can play the move c4, and black is best off just returning the piece. Bishop captures c4, queen captures c4, and now we can close things off with d5. Let's retreat the queen to c3 and e4. But again, white just continues developing. They finish with rook a to d1, and look at black's pieces. This bishop is doing nothing, this knight is awkward, this knight is awkward. White will eventually break with f3 and open things up, and overall, I can't see white not being just much better in this position. But that sacrifice is perhaps not the easiest thing to see, and we are on move 17. The time control is 18 moves an hour, so it wouldn't surprise me if the players were getting perhaps a tiny bit low on time, and so Gunsberg decided to play queen to d2. Okay, fair enough. This does allow Lasker to untangle a little bit, though. He gets bishop to c4 in, kicking the rook, which goes to e1, and now the other knight comes to e6, poking the bishop. Now, the tournament book points out that white doesn't have the option to relieve this tension here by playing the move bishop to h6. The line they give goes bishop captures h6, queen captures h6, and now knight to g4. The queen retreats back to d2, and now queen to e7 is the move they give. And they end by saying that black is in a favorable position. I can see why, because here white has to play knight to f3, and now this knight gets into the game with knight to f4, and I certainly can't imagine white feeling very comfortable at all with these knights in the position. Though what happens in the game I don't think can be much better than this. Gunsberg opts for the move b3, which allows Lasker to take this bishop here on g5, knight captures g5, queen captures g5, and now the bishop retreats back to e6, and the problem here is that h6 is a threat, so Gunsberg has to waste more time moving the queen back to d2. And after this, Lasker simply plays rook a to d8. So it seems that if anybody has escaped this complicated position unharmed, it's Lasker. He's gained the bishop pair, he's not choked under any of the space that Gunsberg has set up, and he's fully completed his development. I can't see this opening being anything other than a complete win for him. The game goes on, Gunsberg brings his knight back to f3, and once again Lasker goes on one of his retreating moves, bishop to c8. Here comes a4 by Gunsberg. The immediate rook a to d1 is given by the tournament book, though after knight to d7 he plays the move now, so no harm done. Lasker puts his knight on f8, and we saw knight on f8 being very useful in the previous game, so there's no reason to assume that won't be the same here. b4 now by Gunsberg, really trying to get some play on the queen side, and Lasker plays bishop to g4. This is one issue you could take with putting the rook on the otherwise desirable d1 square, as now this bishop, which has been rather aimless up until now, has a very reasonable square to occupy. Gunsberg keeps his knight defended with queen to e3, but now this gives Lasker a reason to start the hostilities himself. Now, and only now, does he take on d4. If c captures d4 and d5, of course trying to take advantage of this very perilous e4 pawn. Gunsberg stops to ask his own question with h3, and Lasker takes here on e4. Bishop captures on f3 seems to be slightly preferred by the engine, so after queen captures f3 and let's say knight to e6, now e5 comes and this bishop is blunted. Of course, black is going to get a bunch of play on all of these weak pawns here with moves like queen to b6 and bishop to f8, but this is the kind of concession that I don't think black has to allow if they don't want to. Lasker clearly doesn't want to. He plays d captures on e4, knight captures on e4 from Gunsberg, and now the bishop slides back to e6 once again. We have bishop to b3, and now Lasker is not interested in trading bishops necessarily. He plays queen to b6. He gets the same active play on these pawns without parting with his bishop pair or anything like that. Now, this position was analyzed by the German chess magazine, and they endorsed the move bishop captures on e6, where after knight captures on e6, there's a very utilitarian move here, queen to c3, keeping all of the pawns under control. The justification behind this is that black is not allowed to take the d-pawn, as after knight captures on d4, we're going to trade everything here on d4, bishop d4, rook d4, queen d4, queen d4, rook d4, and at the end of the line, we get knight to f6 here. This rook falls, and white's just up a piece in the endgame. That's that. Gunsberg did not play this move. He instead decided to go for d5, which is one of the moves that's generally available to you in these sorts of isolated queen's pawn positions where you try to simply jettison the pawn and create a weakness in the other side's camp. It does have its merits, though in this particular position, it's very, very dicey. After queen captures on e3 and rook captures on e3, Lasker simply took the pawn. Bishop captures d5, bishop d5, and cd5. And now, if white wants to play this position, they kind of have to go for knight to c5. This does allow a rook trade here on e3, f captures e3, and now b6. This kicks the knight down to d3, and, I mean, white is certainly holding on. After rook to e8, you get king to f2, this guy's protected, but now black's going to get this knight into the game with e6. And this is another one of those endgames where black is up a pawn, and so they're definitely the one with the winning chances, but this is still within the realm of holdable. Gunsberg, however, did not go for knight to c5. He instead played a move that I can only describe as a total hallucination: rook captures on d5. Now, the justification for this, as he shows us very quickly, is that after rook captures on d5, he gets knight to f6 check, opening up an attack on this rook, and in a sense, a double attack with his knight joining the game. And if king to h8 comes, then yeah, black is certainly not going to be having too much fun. But bishop captures on f6, and even if white takes this rook here, he's just down a bishop. And so it was here on move 35 that Isidor Gunsberg resigned the game. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to say about this game. I mean, it was very complicated. If we go up until about move 17 here, this was, up until this point, this was very complex stuff, and if Gunsberg had found this knight h to f5 stuff, then this would have been a very interesting game. And it still was to an extent. He seemed to have lost a little bit of advantage up here when Lasker had completed his development and everything was fine, but again, up until this point, it was still a game, and I was thinking about the endgame at this point, and I was tempted to go through a few lines, but at the end of the day, seeing this rook captures on d5 move is just befuddling. I cannot explain what the idea was here. How did he not see the bishop on f6? And you get what I'm getting at. This was an experience to go through. So with that, Lasker's gauntlet is off to about as good a start as you can expect. The final two opponents, despite not playing for the World Chess Championships themselves, are no less formidable, so there is much more very high-level chess to show. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.